Hey guys, I'm Mnar Muhawesh. Earlier this month on Behind the Headline, I spoke with CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou, who explained how oil and resources have been the driving force behind every U.S. military operation in the Middle East since the 1970s, from Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan to where we are today in Syria. Kiriakou noted that these conflicts can be traced back to an alliance cemented between President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the House of Saud in 1943, roughly 10 years after Standard Oil of California, which later became Chevron, discovered the world's second largest oil reserves in Saudi Arabia. Now, in return for giving the United States control of their oil reserves and airspace, Saudi Arabia would gain control over the oil market and enjoy the power, money, and influence that comes with it. But Saudi Arabia has used this very power, money, and influence to divide and conquer the Middle East and many parts of Africa through the unleashing of terrorism. Of course, none of that would be possible without the financial and arms support from its Western allies, including the United States. Pentagon officials have told me that Saudi Arabia has a printing press operation worth billions that is responsible for not just counterfeiting hadith or traditions and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, but even manufacturing Islamic history books to be exported throughout the Muslim world. Now, the effects of these efforts to rewrite the history of a faith of over 1.5 billion people to suit the Saudi political agenda that limit women's rights, promote radicalism and tyrannical leadership are rippling across the region and the world through radical groups like ISIS and Nusra Front. These are the very same terror groups the United States claims to be fighting in its so-called war on terror. To make sense of this often unhealthy and confusing relationship of interdependency and conflicting agendas is CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou again. Take a look. So thank you so much, John, for joining me again. Continuing our conversation from earlier this month, in 1943, President Roosevelt declared, "The defense of Saudi Arabia is vital to the defense of the United States." In a nutshell, what has this meant for U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East?
Oh, I think this has been the keystone of American foreign policy in the Middle East, for better or for worse. I mean, it's always great to have friends in the region, especially when you find yourself in a time of war and you suddenly need to have air bases or naval bases. But at the same time, we've committed ourselves now for well more than half a century to defending really a right-wing, an extreme right-wing government that has no respect for human rights, no respect for women's rights, no respect for religious freedoms, and in exchange, we buy their oil. We really have a very simple relationship with the Saudis. We buy their oil and they buy our military hardware. It's really that simple. Otherwise, we generally agree on very little in terms of policy. But with that said, we are committed to the survival of the Al Saud regime, and we have proven time and again that we will walk away from our own commitments to international law and to human rights in order to defend and protect that regime.
And I've actually interviewed, and I told you this before, former Pentagon officials like Colonel Wayne Quist, who have said blatantly that Saudi Arabia is the largest manufacturer of radicalism in the world. In fact, Saudi Arabia literally engineers and publishes thousands of fake hadiths and books and historical books about Islam and its history to justify their tyrannical rule while pushing an extremist, perverted, radical ideology and perspective of, Sunni Islam. Of course, most Sunnis would not appreciate that if they only knew. Their efforts are making their way across Sunni mosques and schools and madrasas in the Middle East and Africa, and have created groups like monster groups like ISIS and al-Nusra. So my question for you is, what else do we need to know about Saudi Arabia's terror factory?
Oh, I have always believed that Saudi Arabia was the primary generator and creator of radicals and radical movements around not just the region but around the world. It's the entire. It's not just the government that does this and that supports this extremism. It's the entire structure of government and society in Saudi Arabia. You know, when you have a chairman of the ulama like the former chairman Sheikh bin Baz, for example, who swore until the day he died that the earth was flat. And anyone who argued that the earth was round was subject to the death penalty. The Saudis have a new leader in the ulama by the name of Qahtani, who's from a very honorable and very old family, but he has done absolutely nothing to improve, as I said, human rights, political discourse, the rights of women, anything like that in Saudi Arabia. So really, you have a group of religious extremists who tell the government and its leaders what they should think and what they should do. Now, behind closed doors, they think and do whatever they want. We know that most, if not all, of the senior royals, for example, drink alcohol. They consort with women. They do all the things that the average Saudi is not allowed to do or not supposed to do. But in Saudi Arabia, everybody else is expected to toe the line. So that's domestically. Internationally, you have a government in Riyadh that supports movements around the region and around the world that the United States, and specifically the State Department, have identified as terrorist groups. I'm talking about the Nusra Front, for example. I'm talking about even earlier, some of the jihadi groups in Afghanistan in the 1980s and 1990s. I'm talking about the Hanbali movement, for example, in Southeast Asia. So here we find ourselves as an American government fighting these groups around the world when in fact our dear friends, the Saudis, are organizing them and financing them, and they think nothing of just flouting that to us.
And of course, I mean, as you mentioned, this is politically motivated, not actually motivated, since a lot of these hadith that they're actually using are manufactured and rewritten by themselves. But speaking of this push for terrorism, let's talk about the Shia oil crescent. Most people don't know that the Shias in the Middle East actually reside along the major oil and gas fields across the Middle East. And that just so happens to be where U.S. bases are based, and then also where Saudi influence is the highest. So how can understanding this Shia oil base, how can this help us understand the economic implications of Saudi Arabia's anti-Shiite propaganda? And also its anti-moderate Sunni propaganda as well. And how has our war on terror only enabled Saudi Arabia's religious cleansing of the Middle East?
Oh, that is such an important question, and it's something that I wish everybody who watched the Middle East or studied the Middle East could understand. You're exactly right that most of the areas all through the Middle East, specifically Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, that have oil, are generally populated by Shia Muslims. Now, the Saudi government, and really before the Second Gulf War, the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein, have done everything possible to make sure not only that Shias do not control the oil fields or the oil industry, but even that Shias don't benefit at all from the money that oil brings in. So that's why Saudi Arabia, as wealthy a country as it is, has so many poor people. And most of those poor people are Shia Muslims. Now, you see the same kind of thing in Bahrain, too. Bahrain is a majority Shia country. It's ruled by a Sunni royal family. And instead of spreading the wealth and trying to raise the economic status of their own Shia Muslims, they've instead begun importing people from Syria and Pakistan primarily and giving them Bahraini citizenship so that Sunnis become the majority in Bahrain. You see that all over the place in the region, but the Saudis really are the most heavy-handed about it. The Saudis are the ones that use the iron fist. And the whole name of the game really is just control of the oil and control of the money.
So this use of, religious extremism, I mean, obviously the Saudi monarchy and these Gulf Arab states don't really represent Sunni Islam. I'm sure that most Sunnis would disagree with that and would say that they do not represent the religion.
No, you're absolutely right.
So
this is not what Sunni Islam is all about. Not at all.
So how are they able to do this? I mean, we talked a little bit about the manufacturing of hadiths and influencing these books, but how exactly are they able to push this ideology and be successful in brainwashing people to follow this route?
Well, I think what most Americans don't understand is that Saudi Arabia really is a very closed society. It's not as closed as North Korea, certainly, but try to get into Saudi Arabia without a sponsor, and you can't get into Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were the last government in the Middle East to allow broadcast television in their country, for example. And the only reason they finally allowed television is because Sheikh bin Baz was convinced or became convinced that at least if they had television, they could broadcast the Quran 24 hours a day. And so, at least when I lived in Saudi Arabia, there were 2 Arabic language channels, 1 English language channel, and one channel was just Quran 24 hours a day. The other was religious discussion, religious themed programming, and then every once in a while they would put in an episode of Doogie Howser or the Waltons or something like that. It was very odd. This is a way for the Saudi government to propagandize their own people. And over these many, many years, they've convinced their own people, or at least many of their own people, that this brand of Sunni Islam, this Wahhabi brand of Sunni Islam is the correct path. This is really the only true Islam. And if you talk to Saudis today, many of them really believe that.
Wow, that is just absolutely insane. I mean, the media, of course, at the end always becomes the lapdog of those in power. But with all this talk about manufacturing terrorism and instability through the use of Wahhabi Islam, there's also a real call for freedom, amongst Sunnis even to reject this ideology and Shiites to reject this kind of oppression. But it seems like nearly every revolution across the Middle East has been hijacked by Saudi Arabia's political ambitions. In Egypt is a really good example. Not that the Muslim Brotherhood was any better, but the Sisi government overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood government, and now Egypt is the largest recipient of funds and arms from Saudi Arabia. And in Syria, we have terror groups funded and armed by Saudi Arabia, ISIS and al-Nusra flourishing. And in Bahrain, you talked a little bit about the demographic engineering. So what do regular people in the Middle East need to do to truly free themselves from both Western imperialism? Because let's be honest here, this is able to happen because of Western imperialism and interests, and also Saudi Arabia's political ambitions. What do people really need to do to free themselves from this?
There's really no easy answer to that question. That's a very important and really a very difficult question. I would say that if there's going to be any change, any real change in the Middle East, it's going to take decades, and it's going to have to be revolutionary. But not revolutionary in a violent way, revolutionary in a democratic way. We saw really the beginnings of a truly democratic uprising at the very start of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. And I think that for there to be any success in other countries, they're going to have to follow that Tunisian model, at least from the early days of the uprising. Now, honestly, I don't think there's ever going to be any kind of real change, revolutionary change in Saudi Arabia. And you're right about the Saudis really not just supporting the Sisi government, but bankrolling the Sisi government and ensuring its survival. Saudi Arabia has a very long history of meddling in Egyptian internal affairs, going back to 1958 and to the revolution, the nationalist revolution in Egypt in 1958. So anybody participating in a popular uprising is going to have to fight against Saudi money and Saudi weapons. And honestly, I wish I could say that there's a model, a real model, for transition to democracy in the Middle East that doesn't include blood spilled in the streets. But I think such a model doesn't really exist. The only way you're going to be able to counter the effects of Saudi involvement in other regional countries is by shedding blood.
Wow, that's very unfortunate. I mean, of course, I have a slightly
It's
different.
terrible.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying, but I think the bigger picture is that we're seeing a divide and conquer taking place from Egypt to Syria to
Yes.
Iraq to Yemen, and this push from religious sectarianism, as you put it. So I really think we have to hope for some unity amongst the people.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And there is one model, I would say. It's not a perfect model, but there is one country that at least has begun a transition into a uniquely Middle Eastern form of semi-democracy, and I think that's Kuwait. Kuwaitis used to march in the streets in the 1980s and the early 1990s. And there were riots, and the police would fire tear gas and rubber bullets, and they would arrest a dozen or 24 people and then let them out of prison a couple of weeks or a couple of months later. But this continued to go on. After the Iraqi invasion and occupation, after the reestablishment of the monarchy in Kuwait, people still took to the streets. And the Sabah family finally agreed that there had to be democratic elections. Now, the elections were stacked in a way, in that the Constitution was rewritten so that tribal families got an inordinately large number of parliamentary seats. But at the same time, over the years, even those tribal families have really turned in favor of democracy. So while you still have a monarchy, it's much more of a constitutional monarchy now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And you really do have a form of democracy in Kuwait that's unique to the Middle East. I think that's really the model.
And actually in Kuwait, they do, absolutely represent more of that unity, because they do have the large Sunni, large Shia population, and they're living side by side peacefully.
That's right.
Engaging in very good relations. So hopefully that can be a model for the rest of the Middle East.
I think it could. And may I add something to that, too?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Kuwait had a tough time with elements of their Shia community in the early 1980s. There was a Hezbollah presence in Kuwait in the early 1980s, and the Kuwaiti royal family really reacted with a very heavy hand. And they went in and literally flattened with bulldozers an entire Shia neighborhood where this Hezbollah cell had established itself. They killed people. They arrested a lot of people, and then they immediately began to try to rebuild relations, sectarian relations in the country. Again, one of the reasons why that was sort of propelled was because of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. But now, you've got a country that's 40 or 45% Shia. It has a Sunni royal family, but Shias are heavily represented in the Majlis, and Shias have important positions of authority. There are Shia cabinet ministers. Many of the prominent business families, the Bahbahanis, for example, are Shia Muslims. And people seem to get along well in Kuwait. Again, I think that might be a model for the rest of the region.
So what are they doing that's so different? I mean, they're represented, but what exactly is happening at the base?
At the base, they've given Shia Muslims exactly the same rights that Sunnis have. Plain and simple.
That easy.
It's easy.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to talk to you again, and hopefully we'll have you on again, hopefully in another couple of weeks, and we can continue the conversation about U.S. relations in the Middle East.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.